Please make sure to subscribe the channel and press the bell icon to get notified about our future videos. To the questions. Question 1. You have 20 Azure SQL databases provisioned by using the vCore purchasing model. You plan to create an Azure SQL database elastic pool and add the 20 databases. Which three metrics should you use to size the elastic pool to meet the demands of your workload? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. The correct options are A, C and E, that is total size of all the databases, number of concurrently peaking databases into peak CPU utilization per database, and total number of databases into average CPU utilization per database. About the options. A. Estimate the storage space needed for the pool by adding the number of bytes needed for all the databases in the pool. About C and D. Estimate the vCores needed for the pool as follows. For vCore based purchasing model, max bracket on total number of DBs into average vCore utilization per DB, comma, number of concurrently peaking DBs into peak vCore utilization per DB. Question 2. You have an Azure SQL database that contains a table named Fact Sales. Fact Sales contains the columns shown in the following table. Fact Sales has 6 billion rows and is loaded nightly by using a batch process. You must provide the greatest reduction in space for the database and maximize performance. Which type of compression provides the greatest space reduction for the database? The correct option is D. Column store archival compression. Column store tables and indexes are always stored with column store compression. You can further reduce the size of column store data by configuring an additional compression called archival compression. Note, the column store index is also logically organized as a table with rows and columns, but the data is physically stored in a column-wise data format. Question 3. You have a Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance in an on-premises data center. The instance contains a 4 TB database named DB1. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL database managed instance. What should you use to minimize downtime and data loss during the migration? The correct option is D. Azure Database Migration Service. Azure Database Migration Service can do online migrations with minimal downtime. When you migrate databases to Azure by using Azure Database Migration Service, you can do an offline or an online migration. With an offline migration, application downtime starts when the migration starts. With an online migration, downtime is limited to the time to cut over at the end of migration. We suggest that you test an offline migration to determine whether the downtime is acceptable. If not, do an online migration. Question 4. Hotspot. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2016 server named Server 1 that contains a database named DB1. You need to perform an online migration of DB1 to an Azure SQL database managed instance by using Azure Database Migration Service. How should you configure the backup of DB1? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, backup type. The correct option is full and log backups only. To the next statement, backup option. The correct option is with checksum. About the options, box 1. Make sure to take every backup on a separate backup media. Azure Database Migration Service doesn't support backups that are appended to a single backup file. Take full backup and log backups to a separate backup files. Box 2. Azure Database Migration Service uses the backup and restore method to migrate your on-premises databases to SQL managed instance. Azure Database Migration Service only supports backups created using checksum. Question 5. you are designing a streaming data solution that will ingest variable volumes of data. You need to ensure that you can change the partition count after creation. Which service should you use to ingest data? The correct option is D. Azure Event Hubs Dedicated. The partition count for an event hub in a dedicated event hubs cluster can be increased after the event hub has been created. Question 6. You are designing a date dimension table in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. The date dimension table will be used by all the fact tables. Which distribution type should you recommend to minimize data movement? The correct option is B. Replicate. A replicated table has a full copy of the table available on every compute node. Queries run fast on replicated tables since joins on replicated tables don't require data movement. Replication requires extra storage, though, and isn't practical for large tables. Question 7. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named WS1 that contains an Apache Spark pool named Pool1. You plan to create a database named DB1 in Pool1. You need to ensure that when tables are created in DB1, the tables are available automatically as external tables to the built-in serverless SQL pool. Which format should you use for the tables in DB1? The correct option is C. Parquet. Serverless SQL pool can automatically synchronize metadata from Apache Spark. A serverless SQL pool database will be created for each database existing in serverless Apache Spark pool. For each Spark external table based on Parquet and located in Azure Storage, an external table is created in a serverless SQL pool database. As such, you can shut down your Spark pools and still query Spark external tables from serverless SQL pool. Question 8. You are designing an anomaly detection solution for streaming data from an Azure IoT hub. The solution must meet the following requirements. Send the output to an Azure Synapse, identify spikes and dips in time series data, minimize development and configuration effort. Which should you include in the solution? The correct option is C. Azure Stream Analytics. Anomalies can be identified by routing data via IoT Hub to a built-in ML model in Azure Stream Analytics. Question 9. You are creating a new notebook in Azure Databricks that will support R as the primary language, but will also support Scala and SQL. Which switch should you use to switch between languages? The correct option is B. %language. You can override the default language by specifying the language magic command %language at the beginning of a cell. The supported magic commands are %python, %r, %scala, and %SQL. Question 10. Drag drop. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1. You need to create a partition table in DB1. Which 3 objects should you create in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate objects from the list of objects to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. The objects provided to us are a partition scheme, an aligned index, a file group, a table, a partition function. The correct options are a partition function, a partition scheme, a table. Question 11. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database named SQL DB1. You need to replicate DB1 to SQL DB1. Which type of replication should you use? The correct option is A. Transactional. Question 12. You have an on-premises data center that contains a 2 TB Microsoft SQL Server 2019 database named DB1. You need to recommend a solution to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance. The solution must minimize downtime and administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? The correct option is A. Log replay service. Less administrative effort compared to transactional replication. Question 13. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 database named SQL1 that uses merge replication. You need to migrate SQL1 to Azure. Which service should you use? The correct option is C. SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. Question 14. You have a Microsoft SQL Server 2017 server. You need to migrate the server to Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that the latest version of SQL Server is used. Support the SQL Server Agent service. Minimize administrative effort. What should you use? The correct option is D. Azure SQL Managed Instance. The answer is D because it ensures that the latest version of SQL Server is used. Only SQL-MI is always in latest version. SQL on VM can be in previous version. Question 15. Hotspot. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy an Azure SQL managed instance that meets the following requirements. Optimize latency, maximize the memory to vCore ratio. Which service tier and hardware generation should you use? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, service tier. The correct option is business critical. To the next statement, hardware generation. The correct option is premium series memory optimized. Question 16. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy an Azure SQL database. The solution must meet the following requirements. Dynamically scale CPU resources. Ensure that the database can be paused to reduce costs. What should you use? The correct option is B. The serverless compute tier. Question 17. Your on-premises network contains a Microsoft SQL Server 2016 server that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance. You need to create the SQL managed instance. The solution must minimize the disk latency of the instance. Which service tier should you use? The correct option is A. Business critical. Question 18. Hotspot. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2016 instance that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL managed instance named MI1. You plan to perform an online migration of DB1 to MI1 by using Azure Database Migration Service. You need to create the backups for the migration. The solution must minimize the number of backup files created. Which type of backups should you create and how should you store the backups? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, backup type. The correct option is full and transaction log. To the next statement, to store the backups. The correct option is write each backup to a separate file. Question 19. You have a SQL server on Azure virtual machine instance named SQL VM1 that was deployed by using an Azure Marketplace SQL Server 2019 enterprise image. You need to change the Microsoft SQL Server instance on SQL VM1 to the standard edition. The solution must ensure licensing compliance. What should you do first? The correct option is B. From SQL VM1, uninstall the SQL Server instance. Question 20. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 server that hosts 10 databases that is up to date with patching. You are required to replicate all of the databases to the cloud. Which two options could you recommend? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. The correct options are A and D, that is a SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine Instance and an Azure SQL Managed Instance link. A SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine is required for hybrid, high availability and disaster recovery. Azure SQL Managed Instance link enables near real-time data replication between SQL Server and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Database and an Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool are not the correct options as they cannot be used with always-on availability groups. Question 21. You have two on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instances named SQL1 and SQL2. You need to migrate the databases hosted on SQL1 to Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. The service that hosts the migrated databases must be able to communicate with SQL2 by using linked server connections. Administrative effort must be minimized. What should you use to host the databases? The correct option is C. Azure SQL Managed Instance. Question 22. You have an Azure subscription linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. The subscription contains 10 virtual machines that run Windows Server 2019 and host Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instances. You need to ensure that you can manage the SQL Server instances by using a single user account. What should you do first? The correct option is B. Deploy an Azure AD domain services domain and join the virtual machines to the domain. Question 23. You have an Azure SQL database elastic pool that contains 10 databases. You receive the following alert. You need to resolve the alert. The solution must minimize administrative effort. Which three actions can you perform? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. The correct options are A, C and E. That is, increase the maximum storage of the elastic pool, remove a database from the pool and shrink individual databases. Question 24. Hotspot. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to migrate 10 on-premises Microsoft SQL Server instances to Azure. You need to ensure that the migrated environment can be managed by using multi-server administration and supports master/target jobs. The solution must minimize administrative effort. Which SQL deployment options should you select as the master server and the target server? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, MS6. The correct option is SQL Managed Instances. To the next statement, TS6. The correct option is SQL Managed Instances. Question 25. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a new Azure SQL database by using Azure command line interface. Which three parameters are required? The correct option is C. Name, resource group and server. Question 26. You have an Azure Databricks workspace named Workspace 1 in the standard pricing tier. Workspace 1 contains an all-purpose cluster named Cluster 1. You need to reduce the time it takes for Cluster 1 to start and scale up. The solution must minimize costs. What should you do first? The correct option is C. Create a pool in Workspace 1. You can use Databricks pools to speed up your data pipelines and scale clusters quickly. Databricks pools a managed cache of virtual machine instances that enables clusters to start and scale 4 times faster. Question 27. You plan to deploy an app that includes an Azure SQL database and an Azure web app. The app has the following requirements. The web app must be hosted on an Azure virtual network. The Azure SQL database must be assigned a private IP address. The Azure SQL database must allow connections only from a specific virtual network. You need to recommend a solution that meets the requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? The correct option is A. Azure Private Link. Private Link allows you to connect to various platform as a service services in Azure via a private endpoint. A private endpoint is a private IP address within a specific VNet and subnet. Question 28. You are planning a solution that will use Azure SQL database. Usage of the solution will peak from October 1 to January 1 each year. During peak usage, the database will require the following: 24 cores, 500 GB of storage, 124 GB of memory, more than 50,000 IUPS. During periods of off-peak usage, the service tier of Azure SQL database will be set to standard. Which service tier should you use during peak usage? The correct option is A. Business Critical. Business Critical in vCore purchasing model, because we have requests to scale up and down not only in compute resources but also a storage which is available only via vCore purchasing model. Hyperscale does not suit us as well because it is reversible only within 45 days of the original migration to hyperscale. Question 29. Hotspot. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance that hosts a database named DB1. You plan to perform an online migration of DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance by using the Azure Database Migration Service. You need to create a backup of DB1 that is accessible to the Azure Database Migration Service. What should you run for the backup and where should you store the backup? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, run. The correct option is a full backup and a log backup to separate files by using the with checksum option. To the next statement, store the backup in. The correct option is an SMB file share. About the options, box 1, Azure Database Migration Service does not initiate any backups and instead uses existing backups which you may already have as part of your disaster recovery plan for the migration. Be sure that you take backups using the with checksum option. Box 2, for online migrations from SQL Server to SQL managed instance using Azure Database Migration Service, you must provide the full database backup and subsequent log backups in the SMB network share that the service can use to migrate your databases. Question 30. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 server that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL managed instance named SQLMI1 and a virtual network named VNet1. SQLMI1 resides on VNet1. The on-premises network connects to VNet1 by using an express route connection. You plan to migrate DB1 to SQLMI1 by using Azure Database Migration Service. You need to configure VNet1 to support the migration. What should you do? The correct option is A. Configure service endpoints. During virtual network setup, if you use express route with network peering to Microsoft, add the following service endpoints to the subnet in which the service will be provisioned: target database endpoint, storage endpoint, service bus endpoint. This configuration is necessary because Azure Database Migration Service lacks internet connectivity. Question 31. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server that uses the file tables and file stream features. You plan to migrate to Azure SQL. Which service should you use? The correct option is B. SQL server on an Azure virtual machine. SQL Server VM alternative. Your business might have requirements that makes SQL Server on Azure virtual machine a more suitable target than Azure SQL database. If one of the following condition applies to your business, consider moving to a SQL Server virtual machine instead. You have strict dependency on features that are still not supported, such as file stream/file table, polybase, and cross-instance transactions. Question 32. You need to migrate an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server database to Azure SQL database. The solution must minimize downtime. What should you do? The correct option is C. Configure transactional replication. Use transactional replication when you cannot afford to remove your SQL Server database from production while the migration is occurring. You can use SQL Server transactional replication as your migration solution. Note, there are two primary methods for migrating a SQL Server 2005 or later databases to Azure SQL databases. The first method is simpler but requires some possibly substantial downtime during the migration. The second method is more complex but substantially eliminates downtime during the migration. Question 33. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1. You have a table named table1 that has 20 columns of type char. Row compression for table 1 is enabled. During a database audit, you discover that none of the fields contain more than 150 characters. You need to ensure that you can apply page compression to table 1. What should you do? The correct option is D. Change the column type to varchar 200. We reduce the max length of the column from 400 to 200. Question 34. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server named SQL1 that hosts 5 databases. You need to migrate the database to an Azure SQL managed instance. The solution must minimize downtime and prevent data loss. What should you use? The correct option is B. Backup and restore. DMA does not support database migrations to Azure SQL managed instance. Recommendation is to use the Azure SQL migration extension for Azure Data Studio, which supports both online and offline database migrations to Azure SQL managed instance, but here we don't have the option Azure SQL migration extension for Azure Data Studio. Question 35. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database. The database contains a table named table that uses partitioned column stores. You need to configure table 1 to meet the following requirements. Each partition must be compressed. The compression ratio must be maximized. You must be able to index the compressed data. What should you use? The correct option is B. Column store compression. While column store archival compression can be used to compress column store data in a way that minimizes storage costs, it is not optimized for query performance as it is designed for long-term storage of cold data. In this scenario, the requirement is to maximize compression ratio while still being able to perform index operations on the compressed data. Column store archival compression is not optimized for indexing and as such, it would not meet this requirement. Therefore, the correct answer is B. Column store compression. Question 36. You have an Azure SQL database logical server named Instance1. You create a user named User1 in the master database of Instance1. You need to ensure that User1 can create and delete databases attached to Instance1. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. Which role should you assign to User1? The correct options are A and C, that is DB_DDL admin and DB manager. Members of the DB manager role can create databases. Members of the DB_owner role can perform all activities at the database level. Members of the DB_DDL admin role can run any DDL statements. Members of the login manager can create and delete logins. Question 37. You have a database named DB1 In an Azure SQL managed instance named Instance1, you need to encrypt DB1 by using transparent data encryption. Which 3 actions should you perform before you can start the encryption? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. The correct options are B, C and D. That is, create a certificate in the master database, create a database encryption key in DB1 and create a master key in the master database. The procedure of preparing the database to use TDE is first to create a master key and a certificate in the master database and then to create a database encryption key in the DB1. You should not create a certificate or an asymmetric key in DB1 as TDE can only use certificates created in the master database. Question 38. In an Azure SQL database, you have a table that contains a column named column 1. Column 1 stores credit card CVV data. You need to configure column 1 to meet the following requirements. The data in the column must be protected at rest. The data in the column must be protected when in use. Database administrators must be prevented from viewing the contents of column 1. Which 2 features can you use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. The correct options are A and B, that is always encrypted deterministic encryption and always encrypted randomized encryption. You should use always encrypted because this ensures that the administrators are unable to view and decrypt data. Encryption with symmetric keys will allow the administrators to access the data. Dynamic data masking does not protect data at rest or in use. Question 39. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1 that contains a table named sales. You need to implement change tracking for sales. What should you do first? The correct option is C. Enable change tracking for DB1. You should enable change tracking at the database level first, then you can enable change tracking for each table. Change tracking must be enabled at the database level before it can be enabled for the sales table. Creating a master key in the master database and creating a certification in DB1 are not needed for change tracking. Question 40. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1 that contains a table. The table contains a column that stores email addresses. You need to ensure that reporting users can only view email addresses in a format of a@xx.com. The solution must minimize the impact on other users. What should you configure? The correct option is C. Dynamic data masking. Dynamic data masking will enable users to only see masked values instead of email addresses. Always encrypted protects data in use or in transit. RLS controls access to rows in a table and column encryption will encrypt the data in the column, which can hinder users' ability to view the data.